You know, there's a reason mystery has always had a gravitational pull on the human psyche, especially on men. From ancient myths to modern relationships, we see the same pattern play out. The more something resists full understanding, the more it draws pursuit. This isn't just a poetic observation, it's a deeply embedded psychological reality. The male mind, particularly in the context of attraction, is oriented toward challenge, novelty, and conquest. Not necessarily conquest in a possessive or dominating sense, but in the sense of solving a puzzle, closing a loop, achieving a kind of resolution. And when something resists that resolution, when it doesn't give itself up all at once, it becomes captivating. This is the core idea. Men chase what they can't immediately grasp. The unknown triggers engagement. It demands attention. And here's the paradox. When you hand over full access to your thoughts, your emotions, your presence all at once, you rob the other person of the psychological tension that fuels desire. You make yourself knowable in a way that's complete, and what's complete, by definition, no longer requires pursuit. The game is over, the tension disappears, and so does the energy behind it. Now, let's be clear. This is not about manipulation. This isn't about playing games or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about understanding something fundamental about human nature and using it responsibly. If you respect the nature of desire, you understand that mystery isn't deception. It's restraint. It's the decision not to exhaust your identity in the first 5 minutes of connection. It's the power of allowing someone to earn deeper access to who you are. That process, not just the content of your personality, but the pacing of its unfolding, is what generates value in the eyes of the other. When you create a space of uncertainty, not chaos, but measured unpredictability, you activate something ancient. You engage a psychological structure rooted in exploration and effort. You transform a passive dynamic into an act, if one, because effort creates meaning. What we work for, we value. And when someone has to reach toward you, when they have to navigate ambiguity and interpret signals, they become more emotionally invested. You become a mirror in which they project their own curiosity, their own imagination, even their own ideals. This is why the mysterious woman, the emotionally composed man, the artist who doesn't explain their work, these figures compel us, not because they withhold meaning, but because they invite us to participate in discovering it. And that participation, that process of seeking, is where true connection is born. If you're completely accessible from the start, you deny others the dignity of that journey. So if you want to be pursued, not just noticed, but truly sought after, you have to learn the discipline of partial revelation. You have to resist the impulse to over-explain, to overshare, to make yourself easy to categorize. Because in a world addicted to instant access, the real power belongs to those who know how to remain just out of reach. Give them something to chase, not because you're hiding, but because you're worth discovering. Desire, at its core, is fueled by tension. It lives in the space between want and attainment, when something, or someone, is too easily accessible, that tension dissolves. It's a principle you can observe in every domain of human behavior. We rarely value what we can have at any moment without effort. It's not because we're cruel or shallow, it's because our minds are wired to equate scarcity with significance. What's rare commands focus. What's abundant fades into the background, and this brings us to a hard but necessary truth. Availability kills desire. Not because kindness or consistency are inherently unattractive, but because when something becomes too predictable, too ever-present, it no longer activates the deeper motivational systems within us that are tied to pursuit, longing, and meaning. It becomes part of the furniture, familiar, easy, unremarkable. Now, this doesn't mean you should manufacture distance or play emotional games. What it does mean is that you have to recognize the importance of maintaining some form of energetic independence. If your presence is constantly guaranteed, if you're always reachable, always responding, always giving, then eventually you become part of the environment rather than a focal point within it. People stop orienting themselves toward you because they've subconsciously come to believe you'll always be there, regardless of how they engage with you. And again, this isn't about being cold or withholding affection. It's about preserving your own center of gravity. It's about maintaining the boundaries that protect your time, your energy, and your sense of self. Because when you're too available, what you're really communicating, often unintentionally, is that your value is already fully possessed. There's no need to pursue what's already been acquired, no reason to invest deeper effort when no resistance or challenge is present. Philosophically, this ties back to the idea that longing is often more intense than having. There's a kind of beauty, even nobility, in the chase, not because the end is unimportant, but because the act of striving is what transforms the object of desire into something meaningful. When you allow yourself to be continually pursued, not by playing hard to get, but by being rooted in your own purpose, you become someone worth chasing, not because you're distant, but because you're whole. Think about the dynamics of any great story, whether it's romance, adventure, or personal transformation. The protagonist doesn't walk into the treasure room on page 1. There's a journey, obstacles, a sense that the prize must be earned. That structure mirrors how we find value in relationships. When you're too easy to reach, you flatten the narrative. You rob the other person of the opportunity to rise to the occasion. So the task isn't to disappear or withdraw. It's to maintain a life, internally and externally, that isn't dictated by someone else's presence or approval. Make your availability something intentional, not automatic. When you move like that, people begin to sense your value in a very different way. They feel the weight of your presence because it's not given without discernment. The paradox is simple but profound. When you stop making yourself constantly available, you become infinitely more desirable. There's a common misconception in modern culture that value is something you declare. That if you simply say you're high value, say you deserve respect, say you're worth attention, people will believe you. But that's not how human psychology works. We don't respond to proclamations. We respond to signals. And most of those signals are nonverbal, often subconscious. What you project through your posture, your tone, your emotional self-regulation, your sense of boundaries, those are the things people actually register. That's what they're responding to, whether they realize it or not. Perceived value isn't about what you tell people you're worth. It's about how you carry yourself in a way that communicates, without needing explanation, that your presence is meaningful. And that comes down to something very old, something primal: status, competence, and control of your own emotional world. People chase what feels rare, what feels difficult to access, what seems rooted in internal confidence rather than external validation. Now, let's break that down further. When you're constantly explaining your worth, trying to convince someone to see you a certain way, what you're actually doing unintentionally is admitting you're not sure they'll see it on their own. It's insecurity in disguise, and other people can feel that. They can sense that the value you're presenting isn't grounded in self-knowledge, but in a plea for recognition, and the moment value has to be argued, it's already devalued. Instead, consider how truly high you individuals behave. Whether it's in business, relationships, or creative expression, they rarely feel the need to broadcast their status. Their confidence isn't loud. It's quiet, it's grounded. They're selective with their time, not as a tactic, but because they understand its worth. They're not emotionally reactive, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they have a disciplined inner world. And that self-possession, that quiet authority, is what draws people in. It's the difference between a neon sign that flashes "Look at me" and a rare painting in a private gallery. One is always on, always trying. The other invites approach through its very stillness, and that's what real value looks like. Not performance, but presence. Not noise, but depth. The moment you begin treating yourself as valuable, structurally, not rhetorically, others begin to align their perception accordingly. If your time is protected, if your boundaries are clear, if your emotions are stable, you're sending a consistent message. I don't need to be chosen to be whole. And ironically, that's the very mindset that makes people want to choose you. Because in a world saturated with neediness, the person who moves from abundance stands out. This is the paradox. You don't become desirable by chasing validation. You become desirable by embodying it. Not by proving your worth, but by living in such a way that your worth is self-evident. There's something profoundly attractive, almost gravitational, about emotional autonomy. When someone has a firm grip on their internal world, when they're not easily swayed by approval or rejection, praise or criticism, they project a kind of psychological stability that others find both calming and compelling. And this isn't just a social nicety. It's rooted in something deeper, something evolutionary, because from a biological standpoint, we're drawn to those who appear to have control over themselves. We interpret that control as a marker of strength, of safety, of value. Now, think about this. Most people walk through life outsourcing their emotional state. They let their sense of worth rise and fall with someone else's attention. If they're liked, they feel good. If they're ignored, they collapse. That's not just unsustainable, it's dangerous, because what it means is that your center of gravity isn't inside you, it's out there, somewhere, in the hands of whoever happens to be interacting with you at the moment. And when that happens, you become fundamentally reactive. You're not living, you're responding, but emotional autonomy breaks that pattern. It says, I feel what I feel, and I take full responsibility for how I process it. I'm not dependent on someone else to regulate my mood, validate my choices, or determine my direction. And when you embody that, when that becomes your baseline mode of being, you naturally become more desirable. Because desire isn't about dependency, it's about magnetism, and nothing is more magnetic than someone who does not need to be needed. There's a philosophical principle here too, rooted in Stoic thought. You are only free when your internal state is no longer held hostage by external circumstances. That doesn't mean you don't care about others. It means you aren't owned by them. You can love deeply, you can engage fully, but your identity isn't built on the shifting sands of someone else's behavior. And here's what's fascinating. When you operate from that place of emotional sovereignty, others feel it. They sense it in your silence, in your posture, in your refusal to overreact. You become a kind of anchor, and because most people are internally adrift, they naturally gravitate toward that stability. Not in a needy way, but in the same way a compass seeks north. People are drawn to those who are grounded. This is where true influence is born, not from control or persuasion, but from presence. You don't have to say much when your energy already communicates everything. You don't have to explain yourself when your way of being says, I am whole with or without your approval. That kind of presence doesn't chase, it attracts. It doesn't perform, it simply is. So if you want to become someone others can't ignore, stop trying to be impressive. Start being immovable. Build the kind of emotional life that no one can shake. Because once you've done that, everything else starts to move around you. Emotional independence is not the absence of connection. It's the foundation of all meaningful connection. There's an overlooked form of influence that's quietly powerful, and that's the ability to hold space for ambiguity. Controlled ambiguity, not chaos, not dishonesty, but intentional openness, creates a kind of psychological vacuum that people instinctively want to fill. The human mind is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. We're hardwired to seek patterns, closure, resolution. When we're presented with incomplete information, especially in emotionally charged contexts, we begin projecting. We fill in the gaps with our own narratives, fantasies, and assumptions. And the person who knows how to create that space, to resist the urge to overdefine themselves, wields a subtle but profound form of power. This becomes especially potent in the context of attraction and relationships. If you immediately lay out your intentions, your emotional availability, your entire history, every edge of your personality all at once, you remove the mystery, you deprive the other person of the opportunity to engage in discovery. There's no adventure, no gradual unfolding. The story is already told, and that creates a strange paradox. The more someone knows about you too quickly, the less compelled they are to keep learning. It's not because they're superficial, it's because their psychological curiosity has already been resolved. But when you leave space, deliberate space, for someone to wonder, to interpret, to explore, you activate that inner drive to pursue. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that honors the complexity of human psychology. People want to earn closeness. They want to feel like there's something to be revealed, something just out of reach that keeps drawing them forward. And when you understand that, you stop seeing ambiguity as a weakness. You begin to see it as an instrument. This doesn't mean you become evasive or vague to the point of frustration. It means you allow things to breathe. You don't always explain what you're feeling in the moment. You don't rush to correct every misconception. You don't always make yourself easy to read, because doing so gives others the space to engage, to interpret, and in that engagement, a connection starts to form, not out of obligation, but out of investment. There's also a philosophical layer here. If you look at some of the most profound thinkers, artists, and leaders in history, they rarely presented themselves in a fully digestible, neatly labeled package. Why? Because depth resists simplification. Complexity doesn't shout, it whispers, and that whisper is what draws people closer, not just because they want to understand it, but because they want to be part of the understanding. When you use controlled ambiguity well, what you're really doing is inviting others into a participatory experience. You're saying, in effect, there's more here if you're willing to look. And that subtle invitation, that earned discovery, is far more powerful than any overt declaration of value or intent. So don't be so quick to fill every silence. Don't rush to define yourself in every conversation. Let your presence speak more than your explanations. When people have to work a little to understand you, they often value you far more than if you'd made it easy. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. True power, real, enduring power, is not about control over others. It's about control over yourself. It's about the ability to remain grounded, stable, and unmoved by external circumstances. In a world constantly shifting, filled with unpredictable events and emotions, the person who can maintain their own center of gravity becomes a beacon of influence. That's the kind of power people truly respect and are drawn to. It's not an external dominance, it's an internal mastery. The paradox here is simple. When you stop needing to be chosen, you position yourself to be the one who is chosen. The truth is, most people move through life in a constant state of wanting. They need validation, approval, love, attention. They seek these things because they don't believe they can thrive without them. Their sense of self-worth fluctuates with the ebb and flow of others' opinions and reactions. And because of that, they're perpetually on the defensive, reacting, adjusting, trying to maintain balance. It's an exhausting way to live, but when you let go of that dependency, when you detach from the need for external validation, something shifts. You become emotionally invulnerable, not because you don't care, but because you're no longer ruled by the emotional tides of others. You stop needing anything to complete you. You are already whole, and when you adopt that mindset, people begin to sense it. They start to feel that you are a force unto yourself, not someone who's constantly seeking validation. The key to real influence is in this detachment. It's about creating space where others are drawn to you, not because you're demanding attention, but because they sense your stability. This is not about being distant or cold. It's about being emotionally self-sufficient. When you're not reliant on others for your emotional equilibrium, you become a kind of emotional rock, and people are naturally attracted to that. They want to be around someone who isn't tossed about by the winds of life, but someone who remains rooted no matter what. Philosophically, this ties into the idea of emotional freedom. True freedom comes when you are not at the mercy of anyone's approval or disapproval. You have freedom of choice, the freedom to act based on your values, not your need to fit into someone else's framework. When you've mastered that inner peace, that emotional autonomy, you become a presence that others are drawn to. You offer them something they can't easily find elsewhere, the chance to experience connection, but from a place of strength, not need. This also means that the pursuit of power, influence, and attraction should not come from a place of desperation. When you act from desperation, when you're trying to prove yourself or win someone over, it's transparent. People can feel it, but when you're detached from the outcome, when you've internalized the belief that your happiness and worth do not hinge on being chosen, that's when real attraction takes hold. People respect you not because you're trying to convince them, but because you don't need them to define who you are. The irony here is that detachment doesn't mean emotional distance. It doesn't mean rejecting connection. It means you can fully connect with others deeply, but without becoming emotionally dependent on them. You offer your presence freely without the need for reciprocation, and that, in itself, is an incredibly magnetic force. In the end, true influence comes from not needing to be chosen. It comes from being so rooted in yourself that the world must bend around your stability. You stop chasing, and that's when the power to attract, to influence, and to lead